I'm not nuts about getting into the big technical thing, but if anyone is really curious about what the instruments are making those noises, I don't mind telling them. So, however, I have to find out what they are. I had to jot this down quickly this morning. Well, essentially, the principal instrumentation is a synclavier tube, playing the Gypsy Violin melody. The low viola is the chorale drone and the bass sound. The Fairlight is doing the female voices, which just started to come in. Matrix 12 by Oberheim is doing the middle string like choirs. And Oberheim OBX8 is doing the boom bass. And as is usually the case, regardless what the stuff is that you use to make the sounds, my preoccupation is what you do with the sounds once it's there. I use an awful lot of so-called outboard equipment, harmonizers and reverberation and delay boxes, and I use them in ways that are not industry standard. I use them the way they can be used, but no one does it. And it gives a kind of unique edge to music that otherwise you hear all the time on top of the radio. I'm using exactly the same equipment, but using it in a curious way. I'm not pushing it around. I'm not damaging anything. I mean, after all, it is only circuitry. Nothing is going to happen. But that's where a lot of my composing is really done, is with that equipment that treats the sounds after the fact. Although I must admit, in this particular instance, I was playing, how can I put it, all the sounds you hear on the tape, I was playing to exactly those sounds, but they weren't going on tape. Does that make sense? I made it sound like that after I performed it, but I knew what I wanted it to sound like because I played it while it sounded that way. Very silly. Well, what can I say? What next? What do you want to do? Yes, sir.
So do you often compose in the studio as you're going along on a piece?
Absolutely.
Just kind of realize that it's being produced?
That's right. The recording and the compositional process and the recording process are one and the same.
How did you manage to originally get into this kind of facilities to get that kind of...
That is a very good question. And I can tell you that it's getting easier to do that. Because number one, the equipment is getting better. It's getting less expensive. Doesn't mean that it's cheap. And there's more of it. It's not a mysterious thing anymore. It's all over the place, especially in a large entertainment complex city like we live in. It's everywhere. And you don't need 24 tracks. You can do it on stereo just as well. I've heard great music done purposely on stereo, even though there were 24 tracks available. Why not? It has to do with the person who's using the machine, not what the machine really is. And in fact, I think it's also a good idea to use what is available. I've gone into studios thinking, well, what I'm going to do is thus and such. And I get there and thus and such isn't really there. They've got something else instead. Or they just rented it out. Well, it's nonsense to simply say, well, I just can't work this way. Of course you can work that way. You can work with exactly what's there, always. And never be embarrassed about what it is. I use my son's guitar reverb box. And it's if you just know what its limitations are, it's every bit as good as a $12,000 lexicon. Why not? Use it. You don't have to tell anyone you're using it. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was curious, do you have a different approach when you compose a piece intended for environmental purposes than when you intended for concentrated listening?
Well, likewise, a good question. But I can tell you that none of my pieces are really meant as environmental pieces alone. I mean them to be listening pieces. So I don't think of it in terms of, I guess you're alluding to, quote, ambient music, whatever that is. No, I never think of it in those terms. So there is no different process. It's always the same one.
You had stated that you use machinery much different than the usual way. How so?
Well, now, for example, okay, let's start once again with when I'm talking about industry standards. All of this stuff that you are going to be using, if you haven't already, and I'm sure you will, is a result of rock and roll music. Good. And there are certain ways that's supposed to sound. It has nothing to do with style. I'm not talking about the language, but I'm talking about the signal that goes onto the tape that comes through your FM radio. It's always in a state of flux. It's always changing. There's no question about that. But what many of these instruments can do, particularly when they're coupled with others, is they are there, but that wasn't the primary design purpose for them being there. They are there for other reasons. And we have to go on a one-to-one basis. Well, this means this, and this means this, and there's 100,000 things to talk about suddenly. It just means that I'm using the potential for some of these things in a way that wasn't originally meant to be. Now, for example, I use much more reverberation than would possibly pass muster on a top 40 radio station, because it's not going to go platinum anyway, so there's no worry. For example, I used 70-second reverberation delay on a Lexicon 224, and when I did the mix, I added an additional 10.5 seconds reverb. They have almost a minute and a half of sound hanging on, which means that when you do the mix, a lot of that sound gets in the way. You're continually pulling it down, bringing it up, so that there's as much performance on the board as there is in making the notes that make the piece. You perform a version and mix, in other words. Very, very aggravating sometimes.
When you say that your compositional process and recording process are one and the same, does that mean a lot of that, what we heard, was improvised, or
Yes.
Is there any score?
No, there's no score. No.
You ever make a score?
No, never. No. There's really no need, because it couldn't be duplicated anyway, even by me, so. Yes.
Well, in that vein, when you go into the studio, do you think to yourself, I want this sort of a sound, or do you just sort of experiment?
Well, a little of both. There's nothing strange about that. It would be the same way you did. But if there's a particular project or task that I'm interested in doing, I've usually kind of messed around a little bit beforehand anyway, so I have a pretty good handle on what direction I want to go. I have gone into the studio absolutely cold, have the faintest idea what is going to happen. It's an extremely expensive way to compose music, I can tell you. Yeah. In fact, I brought along a tape of works that Brian Eno and I did, which have never been recorded, probably never will be. But they were a result of absolutely not having the faintest idea what to do that day. And suddenly, I don't know, something rings your bell and you go with it. Let me put that on.